Agent Morris with the NSA.
We have identified some very, very interesting anomalous type of aircraft.
Traffic is quite luminous and is exhibiting some non-ballistic motion. Over.
Move very rapidly at any speed or whether any direction it wanted to go. Fly could change and go to the right or the left or go crossways without hesitating a bit.
What do you think it was?
Well, if they call it a flying saucer, that's what it is.
EWA 517, do you want to report a UFO? Over. Negative. We don't want to report.
Look, it wasn't my worst Wednesday night.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Anomaly-NOW, straight out of Austin, Texas. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Miles Lewis. I'm so happy to be here with you, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking. Thank you for subscribing to the podcast and sending those links around. This is the weekly live news roundup show for the 501c3 nonprofit Anomaly Archives Scientific Anomaly Institute, as I said, based here in Austin, Texas. And let's dive right in. I'm so excited about this new Patreon that we've got and the live monthly lecture series that we started for our folks who are at the Anomaly Academy Cadet tier or higher. That's $10 a month. That gets you access to each month's new live lecture by a Fortean seeker, anomalous researcher. And we've started back in June with our first presenter, Brent Raynes, who you might remember if you've been paying attention. And this, is, of course, is his book, John Keel, The Man, the Myth, and the Ongoing Mysteries by Brent Raynes. Brent's great. Love his work. You can go to apmagazine.info and see a plethora of great free material that he compiles each month for his monthly AP Alternate Perceptions magazine that he's been doing for a really, really long time. Great stuff. And then, of course, coming up next month, rather this month, this Saturday, July 13th, we have Professor WHAM presenting Congratulations, You're a Paranormal Researcher, or How to Keep an Open Mind and Those Blue Rose Petals Forever Fresh. And this is a talk taking inspiration from Eugenia Macer's story, Paul Eno in Twin Peaks. So that's going to be interesting. And if you're not familiar with her, you can find out more about her by going to her website, professorwham.com. And there we go right there. Professor Wham's beautiful site. She blogs, she writes books, and she vlogs. She does video versions of her blog that you can go to her YouTube channel and subscribe there. Great stuff. Recent postings include tornadoes on the edge of the strange. Past postings include my haunted houses, traditions, magical and mystical, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, really check her out, and also check out her book. This is a wonderful book, Mysterious Beauty, Living with the Paranormal in the Hudson Valley. Great stuff, like I say. And oh yeah, so a friend posted this and made me aware of a new book that I immediately acquired because, well, gosh, I had to know. Wilhelm Reich versus the Flying Saucers, an American Tragedy. This is a nonfiction work about Wilhelm Reich and his connection to the UFO phenomenon. And for those who don't know, it's an intriguing story of much interest. And you can find out more at his website, jamesreichbooks.com. The author, James Reich, no relation to Wilhelm Reich other than just the same last name, but no family connections apparently. And yeah, here's the book right there with a little saucer on it. So you might find that interesting. Can't wait to dive into that. And like I said, you can find out more about the patreon.com/Anomaly Archives, and that will show you information about Professor Wham's lecture that's coming up this Saturday. And in case you're not familiar, her publishing name is Dr. C.S. Matthews. She studied paranormal experiences and reports for over 4 decades, has advanced degrees in religious studies and American cultural studies, and is an ardent environmentalist. Very interesting person, always has interesting takes on stuff. So check that out. Okay, so there is, of course, a ton of great stuff over at the Flipboard, flipboard.com/@Anomaly Archives. And can't get to all of it. We're not going to get to Asian elephants bury their dead, new research suggests, or some of these articles by Gideon Reed, this British writer researcher who's published a number of articles. These aren't necessarily recent. There's several things I came across recently that were not recently written, but I had to share because just very interesting stuff, including I had missed this post from Diana Pasulka back in November of 2016. Unidentified aerial phenomena and new research Q&A with Diana Walsh Pasulka and Jacques Vallée, which really intrigues me because it has not pictured here is to the left of him, or to his right, Bertrand Mahoost, a very interesting person in the interpretation of UFO narratives from a psychosocial perspective. In fact, he's considered one of the grandfathers of the psychosocial UFO hypothesis. Anyway, great stuff over there. But let's dive right in. So again, something else that's not that new, but which I think is worth checking out, is over at sentinelnews.substack.com. And Gretchen Stallman, an analysis of the scientific literature on UAPs from 1967 to 2023. Gretchen Stallman submitted an article to ARXIV on March 22nd of this year entitled "Closing the Information Gap in UAP Studies." And this, very interesting. It's pretty easily digestible. It's a great collection of information that I think anybody interested in UFOs will find worthwhile. And just a little bit on Gretchen. She's an assistant professor in the School of Information at Florida State University. She also, has more than 10 years of professional experience related to librarianship and information management, gathered by working in the Joseph R. Skeen Academic Library and as a documentation specialist for the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, ALMA, ALMA, telescope project. If you're not familiar with that name, if that doesn't ring any bells, that's this big, large array down in the desert in Chile in South America. And it's very interesting place in that there's, among the many mummy stories in the UFO scene, is this the Atacama mummy, which is this tiny little, basically embryonic skeleton mummy that's been debunked. Stephen Greer was very interested in this, and Gary Nolan, the famous Gary Nolan researcher, actually I think he kind of came to prominence because in the UFO field because of his investigation of the DNA analysis of that little being. And of course, it has a long history. You can look it up. But anyway, the Atacama Desert is where that was from. And she's associated with this. It doesn't really have anything directly to do with this article, but I still found that interesting. And we'll come back to that desert in a bit. But interestingly, what she did is she did an analysis of information online and in all these journals and whatnot. And as the article says, the study overall aims to begin bridging a gap between UAP studies as an evolving research area in library and information science, LIS. This exploration of scholarly literature about UAP, a topic that potentially represents an emerging interdisciplinary scientific field, aligns with the broader goals of these fields to understand how scientific knowledge evolves and gains legitimacy over time through consensus. Guided by the research question, how has the topic of UFOs UAPs evolved as a subject of scholarly inquiry over time. An exploratory scoping review was conducted by the scientific and technical information platform Web of Science with the following query limited to titles and abstracts. Anyway, it's got some graphs and some pie charts, which is all very interesting. But they did break down the different areas. As you can see here, psychology and other were the largest percentages for subject matter areas, with religion at 13% being the third largest, and then all these other areas ranging from history and philosophy to engineering, geology, sociology, etc., being much, much smaller. And then several of these areas are broken down, and they give links to some of these papers that make up that subset. And so some very interesting stuff here, and especially under social sciences. There's these links to articles. Martina Sanabria shows how narratives such as UFO reports were sensationalized by the media to distract from political corruption in Costa Rica between 1979 and 1985. And then she mentions another article, or the author of this article does. Hayes uncovers the history of the Canadian government's investigation into UFO reports, yada, yada, yada. And then there's another one based on the observation of growth in consumers visiting UFO and alien tourism attractions and locations. Wright presents a multidisciplinary analysis to highlight the relationship between UFOs, extraterrestrials, and the tourism industry. Obviously, legend tripping has become a big thing, and many municipalities have recognized the opportunity there to get a little dinero. Or, oh, I got to find that clip. UFO might as well stand for unidentified financial opportunity. There's some other very interesting bits in here, just tons of stuff. Let's see. There's one, Stice et al. Analyzed national survey data collected 2 months after the ODNI report release and showed that paranormal documentary and reality television viewing, Fox News viewing, YouTube use, and Joe Rogan Experience listening were positively associated with belief in UFOs. Of course, that phrase right there is so just terrible, belief in UFOs. Gee, you cannot not believe in UFOs. They are unidentified flying objects, not necessarily alien or extraterrestrial spacecraft. Anyway, there's some other interesting ones here. Yes, under arts and humanities. Within the humanities classified sources, Hodges and Paxton-Fear analyzed the evolution of the writings, which made it possible to recruit and then reinforce the beliefs of the members of the Heaven's Gate sect by promising them salvation through bodily transformation before their departure aboard UFOs. And then this one, Rose explores racial aspects of UFO abduction narratives from white Americans, suggesting that these stories, which make up an overwhelming majority of such accounts, come from collective feelings of widespread culpability for the enslavement and profiting from African persons. If that interests you, you really should check out our speaker this weekend and find our archive of her past presentations, including the one that she did for our fundraising streamathon in 2020, wherein she talked about the Betty and Barney Hill case. And of course, I became aware of Dr. Matthews, Professor WHAM, because of her dissertation on Black African-American abductees and exploring that aspect of race in all aspects of ufological abduction narratives. Very interesting stuff. Anyway, there's a lot of other great stuff in this article, including some interview questions, and including, of course, the obligatory "How did you get into this?" sort of thing. And let's see, this is one I liked. Could the statistical analysis that you have carried out to study the evolution and distribution by field of scientific publications over the last 60 years be carried out with other types of information sources, such as international journals or media, YouTube, for example? And of course, she says yes. And she even says, I have started some preliminary work in this area, and then later on goes on to confirm that she is in fact going to be working on more of that. And that just intrigues me, of course, because we've covered news articles and reporting about the pseudonymous Isaac Coy over in England, who is constantly working to digitize materials and get them put online at archives such as the AFU Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden, and who's done a lot of what she starts talking about as far as getting transcripts of that and putting it into searchable databases. And so some of this isn't all that new, or maybe she's just not aware of that. Of course, that's not academic work on his part, but lots of interesting potentials here. And yes, so she ends with the question, do you have other study projects on UAPs in preparation? Yes, there is one collaborative project that I am very excited about, but can't discuss right now. I look forward to sharing the outcomes of that project over the next few months. In terms of the literature review presented here, this was a short paper presenting initial results. And she goes on to say, I am doing some preliminary work with social media data to further examine the evolution of UFO discourse, UAP discourse, as she says. Great stuff. Anyway, very, very worth your while. Go check it out. So, I mentioned the Alma Atacama desert location that she's associated with somehow, working with data management, I guess, there. And I've been recently listening to some great podcasts that have reminded me of my intense interest in certain areas, like the idea of the shadow biosphere, the idea that, as John Keel and others have long talked about, human perception is so limited to a very narrow frame of reference, both in terms of our visual ability, our hearing ability, and other sensing. And John Keel and others have suggested that there are, in fact, other things living here with us that we don't normally see. And when we do see them, that's what generates these UFO reports, anomalous encounters. And one of the things that I'm going to get to, and I do want to tip my hat to a friend who passed almost 10 years ago, Ravi Brisbasi, who is somebody I knew through the INAX nonprofit here that I was part of, the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies. And he was a wonderful man, very brilliant. And at some point, I posed the idea to him of what I'm talking about, this idea of, is it possible that there could be other things living here that we don't perceive? And that's when he started telling me about the left-hand, right-hand spin of amino acids and other molecular stuff that talk the building blocks of life, and the idea that everything in our neck of the woods is one-handed direction versus the opposite. And what he was describing with, I don't recall if he actually used the phrase shadow biosphere, but that is the phrase that has become popularized. And I forget exactly when that came about. Let's see, what is the shadow biosphere theory? Shadow biosphere, hypothetically, life supporting system on Earth consisting of microorganisms of unique or unusual molecular structure and biochemical properties, and representing the possibility that life on Earth originated more than once. That's from a June of this year Britannica definition. But let's see, where is this 2015 article, which is titled something different than it says there. Does Earth have a shadow biosphere? Over at Aeon Essays. Earth's alien life forms might be living right under our noses, but how can we find them if we don't know what we're looking for? And there's a paragraph. Let's see if I can find that again. Yeah. So there's a couple of paragraphs I want to read here. We could be poised on another such philosophical precipice, about to discover a second important world hiding amid our own, alien life on our own planet. Today, scientists seek extraterrestrial microbes in geysers of chilled water shooting from Enceladus and in the ocean sloshing beneath the ice crust of Europa. They search for clues that beings once skittered around the formerly wet rocks of Mars. Telescopes peer into the atmosphere of distant exoplanets, hunting for signs of life. But perhaps these efforts are too far afield. If multiple lines of life bubbled up on Earth and evolved separately from our ancient ancestors, we could discover alien biology without leaving this planet. The modern-day descendants of these aliens, quote-unquote, might still be here, squirming around with Van Leeuwenhoek's microbes. Scientists call these hypothetical hangers-on the shadow biosphere. If a shadow biosphere were ever found, it would provide evidence that life isn't a once-in-a-universe statistical accident. If biology can happen twice on one planet, it must have happened countless times on countless other planets. But most of our scientific methods are ill-equipped to discover a shadow biosphere. And that's a problem, says Carol Cleland, the originator of the term and its biggest proponent. The idea came to Cleland, a philosopher at the University of Colorado at Boulder, when she spent a sabbatical year at the Centro de Astrobiologia in Spain. She was studying the scientists who were studying microorganisms. If you have a sample of soil, she asked them, how will you recognize what's in it? The scientists rattled off the usual answers: slide it under a microscope, put it in a petri dish, make millions of DNA copies, catalog the genes. But that party line disturbed Cleland. You couldn't detect anything that wasn't almost identical to familiar Earth life, she said. Their methods assumed that all microbes have genetic material that works like ours. Isn't it possible, Cleland wondered, that life arose more than once here? If so, organisms from a second or third genesis would never turn up in our tests, because our tests are only meant to turn up familiar life. But these organisms, if they exist, would leave traces in the environment, Cleland says. In 2007, in the journal Studies in History and Philosophy of Biological and Biomedical Sciences, Cleland wrote about just such a trace: desert varnish. It's a strange sheen like a hardened waterfall that covers desert rocks all over the planet. The streaks run down the rocks from the desert of El Aziza in Libya to Antarctica's Dry Valley. Desert varnish, into which people have scraped petroglyphs for thousands of years, appears layer by layer, growing only the width of a human hair each millennium. The varnish is replete with arsenic, iron, and manganese, although the rocks it coats are not. No known geochemical or biological processes can account for its ingredients, and yet there it is. Since that discovery, Cleland has urged scientists not to discount, but to seek out such anomalies as the varnish, things that don't quite seem to fit, because maybe they don't fit. Well, there's a ton of other articles that are on this subject of the shadow or hidden biosphere. This one from phys.org, hidden biosphere discovered beneath world's driest hot desert. Oh, what would that be? Atacama in Chile. So, and like I said, there's other articles about this as well. Anyway, I find this fascinating, again, and just the weird intersection of the shadow biosphere, this particular librarian's research, and Gary Nolan's connection to the Atacama. And let's get to some other stuff that involves Gary Nolan at some point. Let's see here. But before we do, remember last week when we talked about the joking news report about people high at Red Rocks concert venue seeing a UFO? Well, and I mentioned, so far as I knew, there had been no investigation of this. It was just an anonymous report on the New Fork website. Well, somebody tracked down the witness. Westword.com, journalist Patricia Calhoun, July 10th. More on that Red Rocks UFO sighting and the lack of photographs. I like this. I'm not saying it was aliens. All right. So they point out that the day that they posted this article was World UFO Day, but honestly, that just the dates are always so weird for UFO week or day. It's June 24th, for goodness sake. Anybody who's been into UFOs knows that the Kenneth Arnold sighting predates the Roswell crash. Anyway, reports of the sighting were no publicity stunt, says Michael Lemon, Lehmann, who was working just his second job as a stagehand at the legendary venue on June 5th, loading out equipment after the all-time low show. quote, I was working there when one of the loaders said, hey, what's that up in the sky? Looks like a spaceship. Lemon recalls he and the dozen or so others on the crew all looked up and holy crap, there it is. There were about 15 bright white lights stacked 3 high, and they're going around this thing. And the lights could help you see its shape, says Lemon. Now, this is definitely more detail than is in, I believe, the original report over on New Fork. And, I was listening to Micah Hanks talk about this, and he seems convinced that this was a misidentification of Starlink. And certainly I've seen plenty of people freaking out over the trail of lights up in the sky and thinking it's, a trail of a squadron of UFOs and flying saucers. But it's hard for me to believe that that could be misidentified. At the same time, I am very familiar of people misidentifying Venus and other celestial objects that have prosaic explanations. But there's other details that really just seem different about this. And so here it goes on. One of the stagehands grabbed a flashlight and illuminated what seemed to be a black oval disc several hundred feet long. Okay, now that had to be it. I think they say they thought it was over a mile or about a mile away. So that would have to be a very powerful flashlight. Now, I've worked with such flashlights. They exist, obviously. But so we've got some extra detail here of lights, not just lights stacked in such a way that they described it as being like a 3-story building, like rows of lights. But they also describe it as being disc shaped, though other news are reporting cigar shaped. But and then this idea of being able to see the craft and the lights that are going around it, illuminating the shape of the craft. Interesting. A flashlight? ? Why not a phone? Why didn't we get a picture? Lemon asked before I can. We're loading a semi. It's dangerous, he answers. Our hands are full and it happened so quickly. We really didn't know what we were looking for. It was maybe 30, 40 seconds. He may not have taken photo, but he took other action. I went home immediately, texted my family, Lemon recalls. Then he called the Jefferson County Sheriff, NORAD, Denver International Airport, and more. I tried calling everything that had airplanes, he says. That's interesting. And that should be verifiable if he's telling the truth. And hopefully, if they were able to reach this person, the other possible witnesses could be interviewed, and it gets more interesting. The next day, Lemon filed a report with NUFOC, National UFO Reporting Center, saying this thing was totally silent. It didn't make a sound. What's even crazier is that as soon as we all started noticing it, it stopped what we were doing to pay attention to it. The craft tipped at an angle and slowly started moving belly first. And that's the other detail that I don't know if I realized the first time I read this last week, but that's very similar to some rare reports by controversial witness researchers like Ray Stanford. Ray Stanford claims to have film footage, and many people have seen this film footage, though he doesn't offer it to be viewed publicly, though some photos have leaked out, of saucers that are moving in a way that, people think of saucers moving like a saucer being skipped across water. But his report of his sighting and a few others out there talk about these things moving, in a vertical position. And that sounds like what he's describing here, which I don't see how that could be Starlink. I don't see, it seems an odd detail for this person to mention, not knowing that kind of history. So yes, he says, the craft tipped at an angle and slowly started moving belly first to the east. Then it started fading away until it was invisible. Now, in that case, I could imagine like the Starlink explanation that, yes, it just kind of goes off at an angle into the sky and becomes less visible until it's not visible anymore. But he says it simply dissolved into the ether. We all watched it vanish. We all saw a giant disc-shaped craft hovering a few hundred feet above the ground with 3 rows of windows and lights. Then we all saw it fade into nothing as soon as it knew it was being watched. So he has contacted MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and there is apparently an investigation going on, but we'll see if anything comes of that. Red Rocks Management says they're not aware of this, but they hope that people would report this if they see such things. Anyway, that's interesting. Just again, like I said last week, an anonymous sighting report alleging multiple witnesses only gets interesting if more witnesses come forward, or at least the one witness that said they made the report or something, some way to investigate this. What's interesting to me also is just how widely this has been reported. You can find so many mainstream news reports about this. And of course, this seems to, as far as I've seen so far, this is the only news report that actually found the alleged report submitter. So meanwhile, over at rawstory.com, this one's actually a couple months old, but I found it pretty interesting. Rawstory.com revealed Pennsylvania has investigated more than a dozen UFO incidents in the past decade. And this came about, the information about this came about through a public hearing. And yeah, so it just makes you wonder, so how many other regions are doing such kind of investigations? This article says Pennsylvania residents have reported to authorities state records show after the head of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, PEMA, casually mentioned during a legislative hearing earlier this year that the agency tracks UFO sightings, the Capital Star obtained records showing PEMA has investigated more than a dozen such events in the last decade. Quote, "We take all reports and we share it with the appropriate agencies to be able to investigate," Padfield told members of the State House Appropriations Committee in February. Often dull and tedious state budget hearings, nonetheless, are a chance for the legislature to grill administration officials about how they plan to spend the taxpayers' money. The cabinet secretaries flesh out the details of the governor's budget proposal, but deliver few bombshells. Every once in a while, however, an answer prompts lawmakers to look up from their stacks of white papers with surprise and demand more. And it was thus as Pennsylvania PEMA Director Randy Padfield fielded a question from State Rep Ben Waxman about potential threats to the state's nuclear plants from drones and unmanned aerial vehicles. Now, they have the video linked to the portion where this comes up. It's very humorous, and of course, some jokes are made here and there. But yeah, you can click on the video, you can follow it, and it's just a few minutes long. I'm not going to play it tonight, but the person reports, quote, "We have had reports of unidentified flying objects in the past," Padfield said, before quickly moving on to the role of the Federal Aviation Administration in regulating drones. So wait, run that back again. What did you say about UFOs? House Appropriations Committee Chairperson Jordan Harris asked when Padfield had finished his answer. Padfield replied that PEMA occasionally gets reports of lights in the sky from county 9/11 centers, and upon investigation, authorities can attribute them to astronomical or earthly sources such as helicopter traffic, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, it's a cute exchange. It's fun. It's nice, but it's nice that this local newspaper went the next step of going, well, they investigate UFO sightings, and got a Freedom of Information Act request. And you can download that actual PDF of the different cases. Nothing really interesting other than stuff over possible nuclear sites. That's definitely interesting. But just an unexpected jewel in the news cycle. And interestingly also let's see. I thought there was something mentioned. Oh, what is it doing now? Wrong. How did that happen? Stop. Okay. Well, never mind. Why won't it? How do I get rid of that? Click somewhere else. No, it's not working. Okay. Well, going to go on to the next article, which is a doozy and is not UFO related or anything else related. And I'll get to Gary Nolan, but scientists create robot controlled by blob of human brain cells. This is crazy. A team of Chinese researchers has stuck a tiny organoid made from human stem cells into the body of a tiny robot, resulting in a Frankensteinian creation that can learn how to complete certain tasks As the South China Morning Post reports, the researchers from Tianjin University and the Southern University of Science and Technology hooked the brain tissue to a neural interface, allowing it to pass on instructions to the humanoid robot body. The goal is to study brain-computer interfaces that can act as a mediator between electrical signals in the brain and computing power. According to a statement by the researchers, the brainy robot is the, quote, world's first open-source brain-on-chip intelligent complex information interaction system, unquote. Yeah. It's not a very in-depth article, but it's just a little too freaky to not go, to go unmentioned. Okay. Trying to get to... Slowly, I'm going to get to Gary Nolan eventually. All right. So, Saul Foundation, founded by Gary Nolan, has a directory where you can download. I think they may be doing a different essay, a different white paper every month. And this fourth one is for July, called Anomalous Health Threats, Health Security Considerations for UAP. And they give a summary of what they're going to talk about, including the important, let's see, is this the one I'm looking for? Nope. Yeah, number 3 in the key findings, UAP-related biological effects can be viewed as a special case of the broader challenge of quote-unquote anomalous health threats, which may range from exposure to radiation or directed energy weapons to unconventional biological agents. Now, this obviously the dangers associated with close encounters have long been a point of contention. Many people don't even think about this, but Jacques Vallée and others for a long time have warned about the dangers of getting too close to these things. And some of the more alternative hypotheses associated with UFO origins have to do with this idea that whatever the UFO phenomenon is, it is some kind of energy out there that you're witnessing, and your perceptions and your other physiological processes and then the whole environment can be affected by this. Thus, the idea of radiation burns in the landscape, on the ground, and the plants around. This is another way that researchers can investigate close encounter landing sites, is to try to get, biological samples, geological or dirt samples, or see if the person has been affected. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding the Skinwalker Ranch investigation site and the obvious alleged physiological effects there, going so far as to be criticized for being a human lab experiment on the security personnel and others there on site. Now, this article, this paper, I haven't had the chance to really process it, but it may or may not actually mention something else that's related to all of this, and that's AHI, anomalous health incidents, which then connects to the mystery hum and Havana syndrome phenomenon, which then again comes back to Gary Nolan. Now, this past weekend or so, the MUFON annual symposium was held here in Texas, and one of the interesting presentations was apparently by this gentleman, Dr. Roger Stankovich, called The Havana Effect on UFO Witnesses and What the Government Isn't Telling Us. The enigma of Havana syndrome, which lies under the umbrella of AHIs, is of great interest since the actor is still unknown or its identity is highly classified. Havana syndrome was first discovered affecting U.S. diplomats and intelligence staff at the former U.S. Embassy in Havana, Cuba, in November 2016. Now, many cases have been found throughout the world. Victims report a painful acoustic sensation from a hitherto unknown source that causes debilitating symptoms of headache, nausea, anxiety, vertigo, to name a few. Many staff resign from their positions due to decreased cognitive functioning. Investigations by the U.S. Intelligence Community Experts Panel, the Jason Scientific Advisory Panel et al. Failed to discover an actor and how the damage was inflicted, speculating that it could be a form of directed electromagnetic or ionizing energy. In March of 2023, the Washington Post made the public aware that Havana syndrome could not be attributed to any foreign adversaries following these extensive intelligence review findings. Researcher Dr. Gary Nolan observed something plaques in patients who suffered from AHI in MRI scans of the brain. So very curious to see this gentleman's presentation. I'm pretty sure he's been interviewed many times on different podcasts, so there's probably some other interviews where he touches on this online. Of course, I recently was seeing more reporting on this, people making this connection to the UFO thing, of course. And of course, it was Gary Nolan himself, and this may be the first time I saw this, but Vice.com reported on this back in 2021. Stanford professor Gary Nolan is analyzing anomalous materials from UFO crashes, but he also talks about Havana syndrome. Did the people who claimed that they'd had an encounter, especially the pilots, describe any perceivable decrease in neurological capacity? So Nolan has talked about analyzing the brain scans of military witnesses to UFO phenomenon and seeing evidence that mimics the damage caused by whatever the Havana syndrome. And again, folks are now really, like with UAP, trying to get away from UFO, rebrand it as UAP, rebrand Havana syndrome, which obviously only is called that because that's where we first heard these reports, but they've been reported all over the world, including here in the United States, including in Washington, D.C., possibly even in the White House. Gary Nolan says, in answer to the question, of the 100 or so patients that we looked at, about a quarter of them died from their injuries. The majority of these patients had symptomology that's basically identical to what's now called Havana syndrome. We think amongst this bucket list of cases, we had the first Havana syndrome patients. Once this turned into a national security problem with the Havana syndrome, I was locked out of all of the access to the files because it's now a serious potential international incident if they ever figured out who's been doing it. That still left individuals who had seen UAPs. They didn't have Havana syndrome. They had a smorgasbord of other symptoms. And then they go on to talk about Skinwalker Ranch for obvious reasons. And if you're not familiar, again, there are dangerous health effects. In fact, I was going to mention a few minutes ago, there's the famous fireman's manual where there's a chapter on UFOs and the idea of, in emergencies, how responding emergency crews, what they should know if they happen to encounter a UFO. And part of it is be aware that there could be dangerous radiation or other electromagnetic effects. But yeah, there's a ton of references online to Nolan talking about Havana syndrome. And this firstpost.com article from a few years ago, Nolan further disclosed his involvement with the CIA, where he utilized his expertise in immunology to investigate medical issues experienced by individuals allegedly affected by interactions with unidentified aerial phenomena. He noted the striking similarity between the symptoms exhibited by these patients and the condition known as Havana syndrome, which was first reported in Cuba in 2016 and has affected several U.S. officials and military personnel stationed abroad. I also want to point out that in that previous statement by Nolan and others, including Stankovic, they're saying that there's been no identified foreign responsible, but there is a whole other narrative saying that no, they've pretty well identified, and there are researchers who, one of the lawyers who's representing these victims has said, and others are saying that no, it's quite probably a branch of intelligence in the Soviet Union that's responsible to it, and it's implied that they've actually tracked some of these individuals. Now, this is old news to anybody who's been studying psychotronics, electromagnetic weaponry, non-lethal weaponry for any length of time. The reason back in the 90s I published a zine called ELF Infested Spaces. Elf Infested Spaces was both a play on Terence McKenna's phrase Elf Infested Spaces to describe the DMT realm, but was also a nod to all the literature about the possibility of ELF being a transmitter wave for psychic phenomena, anomalous cognition and information, ESP, but also mind control technologies. And there's a huge amount of literature out there about how you can manipulate people's brainwaves through electromagnetics and influence their behavior or induce voices. Over at Willie Strieber's UnknownCountry.com is this article from May of this year. The government is lying. Attorney Mark Zaid, Z-A-I-D, discusses Havana Syndrome cover-up, or AHIs. This is a nice, lengthy article with links to one of the other places where you can see that interview with Zaid, the May 1st edition of Matt West's The Good Trouble Show. And where Zaid says, quote, he was retained by State Department personnel, real diplomats who were based in Havana, to represent them in their efforts to have the federal government recognize their long-term debilitating symptoms. This set of diplomatic clients was soon followed by clients from the Defense Intelligence Agency, from the CIA, FBI, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and from the Commerce Department. So this has really had wide-ranging effects. Is there a UFO connection? Well, seemingly, allegedly, according to Gary Nolan, but of course, as he said, those files have been taken away from him because of the national security element of this. Who knows? And there's just to drive this home, another reference over in a interview that Gary Nolan did with Tucker Carlson. This website, summarize.tech, has a, I guess, AI generated summary of that interview, in which it mentions in the first 5 minutes, Gary Nolan discusses the physical effects of UFOs on humans. He mentions a military personnel who had an interaction with an object in Great Britain near a nuclear bunker and later suffered from nauseousness and long-term consequences to his heart. While he acknowledges that it is open to debate whether the object directly caused these medical consequences, he uses this example to highlight the potential physical effects of UFOs on human bodies. Dr. Nolan also talks about the government's handling of cases like Havana Syndrome and UFO sightings and how they're eventually categorized for further investigation. Wild stuff. Okay, in the home stretch here. I keep coming back to contrails, chemtrails, geoengineering. I was recently reminded of this article from almost 10 years ago. Smithsonian Magazine headline: Airplane contrails may be creating accidental geoengineering. Dissipating haze from plane exhaust alters how sunlight reaches the earth and may be unintentionally affecting our climate. By Sarah Zielinski, December 16, 2015. Again, it's not that surprising that cloud cover influences temperatures and heating and so forth. So it says geoengineering involves the manipulation of an environmental process in such a way, usually deliberate, that it affects the Earth's climate. For instance, previous researchers have proposed combating global warming by intentionally seeding the atmosphere with small particles or aerosols to scatter some sunlight and reduce the amount of heat trapped by greenhouse gases. Long and his colleagues don't yet have enough data to know how much of an effect the icy haze left by airplanes may be having on the climate, or whether it is contributing to warming or cooling, but its existence demonstrates yet another way that humans might be altering the climate system, Long says, and quote, you can see this with your own eyes. The discovery comes out of studies of how much sunlight reaches the Earth's surface. The energy is not constant. From the 50s to the 80s, for instance, the sun seemed to slightly dim. Then it started to brighten. When scientists looked for a cause, they tried linking these changes to the sun's variable output, said Martin Wild of the Institute for Atmospheric and Climate Science at ETH Zurich. during the press conference, but they couldn't find any correlations. Quote, if it's not the sun, it must be the atmosphere responsible for the change, she said. High levels of pollution in the mid-20th century sent massive amounts of aerosols into the atmosphere where they blocked some of the sun's energy, but when places like the United States and Europe began polluting less, the amount of aerosols decreased and the sun appeared to slightly brighten. Now, this is from 2015. And more recently, there's this essay research article from Communications, Earth, and Environment that's over at nature.com. Cleaner burning aviation fuel can reduce contrail cloudiness. That's the hypothesis. Now, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned on this show that many years ago, and I think it was in like 2002 or 3, my dad showed me a magazine. It was an aviation magazine, mainstream, that was talking about how regional climates were being changed by thick amounts of contrails. That, like, where the contrails were the most prolific over airports and high traffic air traffic zones, that they were seeing a change in the climate and the environment, that they were like, look, it's clearly because of the effects of all these contrails. And I know early on in the rise of the chemtrail conspiracy theories, there was a lot of people talking about, and Alex Jones may have been one of those, who suggested that there had been some change in the jet fuel, that there was some new ingredient either added or taken out that was causing contrails to be more persistent and last longer. Well, again, not saying whether this is true or not, but here is somebody investigating that very idea, the idea of aviation fuel having an effect on those contrails. And this is from circa 2021, June. Meanwhile, jump forward to January of 2023. Over at CNN, contrails are a problem for aviation, but could be an easy solution. And this article has some interesting statistics that are probably outdated now, but saying that these contrails might be innocuous, but they're not. Contrails are surprisingly bad for the environment. A study that looked at aviation's contribution to climate change between 2000 and 2018 concluded that contrails create 57% of the sector's warming impact, significantly more than the CO2 emissions from burning fuel. They do so by trapping heat that would otherwise be released into space, and yet the problem may have an apparently straightforward solution. Researchers say that by targeting specific flights that have a high chance of producing contrails and varying their flight path ever so slightly, much of the damage could be prevented. And sure enough, somebody started a business to look into this. That company is called Cetavia. Cetavia pivoted to tackling contrails by developing a weather prediction model that can forecast the conditions that lead to their formation. Of contrails' climate impact, quote, 80 or 90% is coming from only maybe 5 to 10% of all flights, says Durant. Simply redirecting a small proportion of flights can actually save the majority of the contrail climate impact, unquote. The approach Cetavia is taking is to target those 5 to 10% of flights on any given day and modify their flight plans before the aircraft have even taken off. That means changing their altitude or route to avoid flying through parts of the atmosphere which are prone to forming persistent contrails. Well, that's novel. And I'd never seen or heard anything about this and came across it, so looked up Cetavia. And sure enough, this is fairly recent, April of 2024. Cetavia reports from 10-month contrail management trial involving 12 airlines. They've claimed significant reduction in climate warming contrails from a range of commercial jet types during a 10-month test program conducted last year on 65 flights operated by 12 airlines. Again, I'll provide the link to this. You can read into it. I know this is far afield from the para-oriented subject matter of the Anomaly Archives, but it's, I think, fascinating for obvious reasons. Dovetails with so much of the conspiracy culture and literature and ideas about this. And then I think I found this other article from last year, same nature.com, Communications, Earth, and Environment, public perceptions on solar geoengineering from focus groups in 22 countries. Anyway, just I found interesting just to see. So what are people's thoughts on this? And yeah, they compare results against previous research on the public perceptions of solar engineering, as well as wider activities in assessment, innovation, and decision making. And they found that Global South groups exhibit greater hope, but an arguably richer range of concerns for solar geoengineering. And yes, solar geoengineering, a set of hypothetical or unscaled proposals for offsetting global warming by reflecting incoming sunlight and lowering temperatures at regional to planetary scales. I hope you find that interesting. I sure do. Well, I think that was it. That may have been the last. That's a lot to go through, folks. Thank you for staying with it. And we'll be back soon. Oh, I should just, again, remind you about the upcoming event we've got going on this Saturday. That's Professor WHAM giving her lecture, Congratulations, You're a Paranormal Researcher, or How to Keep an Open Mind, and those blue rose petals forever fresh. Of course, the blue rose petals being a reference to David Lynch's Twin Peaks and the movie version, Fire Walk with Me, and basically this idea of an X-Files. The Blue Rose reports were kind of the predecessor to the X-Files, as was the series Twin Peaks. And then coming up next month, if you're a member of our Anomaly Academy Cadet tier over at our Patreon, we've got other presentation coming up, including Joshua Cutchin on August 24th, who will be talking about SoulCraft, understanding the UFO as a death symbol. This is a fascinating subject. Joshua Cutchin is an amazing researcher and has done just so much needed research into these cross-cultural narratives that seem to dovetail in ways that might be unexpected to most. So again, yeah, check out the upcoming events this weekend with Professor WHAM, and you can find out more at patreon.com/Anomaly Archives. Well, thanks again for joining us, everybody. I'm Smiles Lewis signing off. Good night.